Hello, and a very warm welcome to this UKAAF webinar, particularly if this is your first time. I'm Roger Firman from the UK Association for Accessible Formats. Today, the topic is Beyond Inclusion, Design for Interdependent Futures. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available from the UKAAF website. I should like to thank Claire and colleagues for help with the technical side of this event. To simplify the method of asking a question, could you send an email to admin@ukaaf.org? And we think that will be certainly a simpler way than trying to mute and unmute microphones. It now gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Sara Hendren, who is joining us from the USA. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
With so many strands to your career, from practical to conceptual, how did your journey begin in terms of art, design and research, and then combining those?
Yes, well, I'll tell you the kind of medium version because it spans something like 25 years. My training is in visual arts, in painting and drawing from the early 90s, and I didn't have design or engineering or indeed disability politics in my horizon for a long time after that. I spent a couple of years in education research, and then I started a PhD in cultural history at the University of California in Los Angeles, and was thinking a lot about material culture in history and how it does its work and how it tells us something about societies and the way that artifacts bear both a reflection of values in culture, but also do a formative work of shaping that culture by the very look and feel of the stuff we use every day. And unbeknownst to me, I was sort of being prepared then to think about disability, about prosthetics, about assistive technology. But again, it wasn't in my immediate purview when I was in that PhD program. I ended up leaving that program pretty far in because I started to miss the kind of making and producing of artifacts. So at about age 30, actually, I left that PhD program after I'd gotten my master's, and went back to making paintings, sort of rented a studio to try to think about what was next. And also my husband and I decided to start a family at that time. And we had 3 children in my 30s. The eldest of them, his name is Graham, and he has Down syndrome. And his arrival was a kind of opening moment, both to the long history of disability, of the kind of barriers to inclusion, of a kind of, legal and educational system into which he would enter, and the rights and possibilities for that, which were recent and really, really hard won. But also at the same time, even when he was very small, we would go to physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, a number of doctors' offices, and all of those environments were just replete and full of the material culture of disability and what's called assistive technology, and indeed design. So the things that he wore, the littlest glasses that he wore as a baby, the orthotic braces for his shoes to help him learn to walk, the balls and the mats and the sensory toys, all manner of material culture that was meant for him to bridge the gap between his body, his low muscle tone, and some of those challenges, and then the normative structures of the world. So all that training in painting and cultural history and kind of material artifacts just lit up my imagination about what it is that disability produces in the world, and the history of that, the way that curb cuts and closed captioning and all kinds of technologies have come to light and have come to be normalized in the world, thanks to the work of people with disabilities and to the design, the ingenious, creative urgency of the design and redesign of the world to make that bridge that gap more easily. So I went back to graduate school after my kids were born in design to try to kind of pursue this further. And in the course of that, it was kind of an MFA in public design. I realized that if I wanted to be working and thinking about assistive technology and the design of an accessible world, I'd probably do that best work in the heart of where technology is made. And long story short, about a year after I finished that master's degree, a job in design opened up at Olin College of Engineering, which is right here outside Boston, and where all students study engineering. But Olin is a kind of laboratory school for rethinking engineering education. So it is very project-based, it's multidisciplinary, and people are trying there to look at the way that technology gets developed very much in the context of people's lives, because that is, after all, what engineering is and does and produces. So I was able to pitch a role to them to look at disability and technology from the vantage of design, but with a kind of art background to do it. And so that's where I've been for the last 8 years.
Yes, Olin College sounds a really interesting place, and I wonder if you could tell us something about the college more generally and what attracted. I think you've already mentioned about what attracted you to go there, but
Yeah.
it does have some other interesting features, doesn't it? Specifically in terms of engineering, and it's
Indeed, it does. Yeah. And if people are my age, middle-aged or older, it'll be surprising maybe to hear, because engineering typically, at least in the United States, has been taught for the last half century. I mean, changing in the last couple of decades, but for the last half century, it has been taught with a heavy emphasis on the abstract sciences and mathematics. So most people who would go into engineering would spend 3.5 years at university, mostly, doing problem sets and sort of working out the analysis part of engineering. And we certainly do that at Olin. Students do higher order math and thermodynamics and all of those principles. But 20 years ago, folks here in the US were looking at the challenges of the 21st century and saying to themselves, well, engineering doesn't really fit into those neat disciplinary boxes. We should really be thinking about globalization, kind of systems level thinking, certainly the digital revolution and the internet. And how are we going to train students for that kind of complex problem solving? And so Olin was designed about 20 years ago. It's brand new. Precisely to try to think about that and to get students actually building and prototyping in that applied way from their very first days on campus. So, for example, all students, when they enter as first-year students, they design in their first semester a kind of play experience, a toy experience for fourth graders. They have to think about who their audience is, like what does a fourth grader typically enjoy, what would be a kind of play environment with either a gadget or a kind of environment that they would find fun, and might it do some educational work, and what's safe enough to make their parents happy, and so on. And we have fourth graders who typically come to campus then at the end of the semester and walk around with little clipboards and kind of grade and assess those designs that students have made. And so students get a very quick experience, and they repeat that then in lots of ways over 4 years, but they get a very quick experience in testing the thing that they think will address a problem or an issue in the world against the actual audience who will use that thing. And they try to shorten that loop then between the kind of abstract nature of the laboratory and the messy environs of the real world. And so that drew me to Olin for sure, because it made me feel, as somebody who's not trained as an engineer, it did make me feel some confidence that there's a role for a lot of voices here to scope questions, to ask the big why and should questions about our technologies. So who is asking for them, and how do we know that we're building the right thing, and who would we involve in the process, and who has the expertise, and so on. So I've been able to use my time there to invite collaborators with disabilities to campus to educate students about disability history, about the deep work of adaptation that's always happening in disability, and then to think not in terms of problem solving, which is that kind of engineering default, but instead to think of the rich kind of generative questions that we might ask of what our technology and design does when it meets a variety of bodily experiences. And for students to think not just about challenges, but also the assets of a human experience like disability and all the inventiveness, and political urgency, as I said before, of what it means to be disabled in the world and to greet a world that is not always hospitable to it. So it's a lively place to work, and I feel like I'm getting a kind of do-over of my own, kind of high
Yes.
school, college
Yeah.
education.
And I wonder if you could say something about the different paths that your students take and how they might influence accessibility, usability, and disability careers.
Yes, certainly. I mean, we have an electrical engineering major, a mechanical engineering major, a kind of computing major. So they go out and work at different scales of design. So in software and in hardware, we have a lot of people certainly who go to Silicon Valley. And there are people now who we have a wonderful class that's part anthropology and part design, where students are paired and matched with older adults in our local community in Needham. And so many of them go out and are quite passionate about design and aging, that rich and dimensional process. So we have students who work, at Microsoft actually now on accessibility stuff, either formally or among task forces, kind of across teams. We certainly have students who go out and are passionate about that kind of aging process. So I know a student who's in a startup in Silicon Valley around providing mobile services for older adults. So we have students, working, they go on to robotics, they go on to low-tech and high-tech prosthetics of all kinds. And students are passionate about it because they see, usually engineers are drawn to the field because they need to see the output of their work in a really connected way. They're not content with kind of basic science and those kinds of laboratory questions. They want the kind of vigorous engagement with the world. So they certainly are. They get lots of experiences in accessibility at Olin, and they look for it when they finish, if they can.
Thank you. Sarah, you've written a fascinating and informative book, What Can a Body Do? Would you like to give us an overview? But just before you do that, I'd like to play a snatch of audio.
Certainly.
Well, perhaps explain, Sarah, what that is.
I did not hear the clip.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, I just want to make sure that I'm hearing what you intend.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, right. Okay. I think in that, well, the recording was there of a little snatch of the Music for Eyes.
Oh, okay. So shall I tell about what that is?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
please do.
Sure. So this is not in the book. This is in my kind of design collaboration practice that is at Olin. And it's very typical of the kinds of things that I do. So what you've heard there is a composition of music that is in part using a highly unusual instrument. That is a navigational cane for an artist named Carmen Papalia, who's Canadian and blind, and also makes quite a bit of art in engagement with the phenomenon of his own, sightedness, non-sightedness. I mean, he sees very little, and so he uses this cane to navigate through the world in the way that people do who don't use their eyes. But he has he would say, a kind of vexed relationship to that cane and to the assistance that it brings him or doesn't bring to him in the public street. So he finds that people approach him all the time to offer him help that he doesn't actually really need, and often he is without the help that he does need. And so his relationship to that cane is one of kind of humor and comedy, and also one of a kind of fraught politics. So he ends up making a lot of artistic work with and around that cane. So he came to Olin and my kind of laboratory classroom and said, can we take this cane and somehow make it into an instrument that would engage and even play the built environment. And so it's a long story, but students actually worked with him to put a contact microphone in the end of the cane that touches the ground, and to amplify what that microphone picks up, so the sweep of a carpet or the concrete or a brick sidewalk, and to play it via a kind of, I would have called it a boombox 30 years ago, but a kind of radio, portable kind of radio player that has a bunch of reverb on its knobs and the capacity to amplify and distort sounds. And could he then turn what is a navigational cane into what he calls an acoustic mobility device? So I don't need to tell you that this is not a practical object at all, and it's not really meant to do a work of accessibility in the traditional sense. My book is full of very traditional and pragmatic accessible tools. But I like to work with artists because, like Carmen, they have a way of investigating our relationships to assistive technology in a way that surprises us, maybe makes us think twice about our expectations, that does this work that art often does, which is to provide an enigma, to kind of shake up our categories and say, what is that supposed to be about? So Carmen, makes all these works that, again, have a kind of funny register to them, but are also quite politically powerful. And when he's playing that cane in public, people don't really know what to make of it. They don't really know what to think about him as a blind man on the sidewalk and all their categories and ideas of what that person is and does, what he needs or wants, his pleasures, his challenges. And that, to me, does a really productive, creative act in the world, which is to say, it helps us to back away from our categories of assistance and need that only accrues to people with visible disabilities of various kinds. Those are very real, those challenges, but Carmen helps us to see that all of us are seeking assistance of various kinds, that each of us has a capacity to play, to make artful use of our material culture, and to express all kinds of strange adaptations and reuses of the technologies in our everyday lives that we don't expect. So Carmen then, can create this kind of public performance of playing the built environment, but then he also partnered with a musician who used that instrument to then combine with other instruments for a composition that you heard called Music for Eyes. And again, people may hear that and think like, well, this is perhaps a strange little thought experiment. How is it really assistive technology? That, for me, is the kind of the art end of what stretches between art and design all the way to engineering and assistive technology. That it does the kind of, again, expressive, kind of metaphorical, strange work of art that is in dialogue, after all, with the much more pragmatic wishes that we might have for a navigational cane, for tactile pavers on the street, for audible crosswalk signals, for any number of practical technologies. Art always helps us do that symbolic work of how we make sense of each other. I wonder how that lands for you, Roger, just in terms of your own experience in music and what Carmen's remixing does in your mind's eye.
I think it's a very interesting take on what what many of us use in terms of a mobility aid, and just using it in a totally different way. So it is a fascinating world, isn't it, really, and of thought and creativity, and very interesting that somebody is thinking slightly differently about a white cane known to many of us through life. So it's a fascinating experience, really. And I just wonder if you could just give a little dip into your book, because I'm sure there will be I have read it, yes, but there's some really interesting things in it, and obviously we can't talk about it all, but I wonder if you could just give a quick overview of it, Sarah.
Yes, certainly. So the book is it's meant to do a kind of introductory work for people who may not have experience either with disability or design, and on purpose, neither of those words appears in the title, because I'm trying to invite people to both of those subjects who may not think that those subjects have to do with them. They may think of design as, a kind of rarefied field of expertise, sort of architects, doing their genius thing in the studio, or they may think of disability as a very particular issue topic or identity topic that doesn't, reach beyond and collect all of us, when in fact it does. So I was trying to write the kind of introductory book that I was looking for, especially in introducing students to these ideas for the first time. And because I have spent the last 10 years meeting and working with and partnering with people with disabilities themselves, doing incredible, ingenious design work of their own, I wanted those stories to be at the center. That is, how are people with disabilities remaking the world in the present day? Also, how have they done so in the past? Because the past is rich with that kind of design work. Sometimes it's not seen as design because it hasn't proceeded from the expertise of industrial design or formal architecture, but it is design nonetheless. So the book is full of those stories, and some of which are in the past and some in the present day, of people with disabilities navigating their worlds with and around objects that they make or make in partnership with others. And then it has I'm stringing together a lot of the pretty dense scholarship in disability studies that I'm trying to translate for the general reader. So again, disability studies as an academic field comes from the humanities, but extends now into design and technology. And so what I've tried to do is to condense and to make in plain language that field also more visible to people. So the book is structured in a way that traces design we call scales of design. So everything from wearables that you would put on the body. So the first chapter is about prosthetic limbs, their history and connection to the military, people who are using high-tech prosthetic limbs, people who are building their own makeshift workaday kind of prosthetics in their homes. So we visit a man who has one of the, kind of best that money can buy in the engineering sense, myoelectric arms that he's been using since he was 14. But we also drop in on a 30-something young father who was born with one arm and who built for himself for $10 or something, a little holster made of felted wool and some soft leather that he uses as a holster to suspend his newborn baby's little ankles while he changes his diaper. It's a prosthetic for one use for a short amount of time in his young children's lives. But I invite the reader there with 5 other stories of prosthetics to see all those material artifacts on a continuum, that they actually share this mode of formal and informal assistance and the ingeniousness again behind those. So we see everything from the very high tech to the low tech. We look at the kind of military history, veterans, and so on, and think about the work that prosthetics do in the world, in the places we expect to see them and the places that we don't. And it goes from there, from those things you would wear on the body, increasingly outward. So I'm just gesturing sort of one scale out from my body, but then at the scale of the room and the street and so on. So the next chapter is called Chair. It's about products, furniture, and we dip into the history of universal design a little bit there. The next chapter is called Room, and we go to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. and look at deaf space, so architecture built around deafness, not to make the condition of hearing, but instead to celebrate and organize around the beautiful visuality of sign language and all of the social work that goes around that. We also visit a dementia village in Weesp in the Netherlands. Probably some of you are familiar with architecture for dementia and memory care. That's a burgeoning field of design, in part as treatment, that I think people probably don't realize is used alongside pharmacology as treatment. It's really fascinating. We go from there out to the street. So it's this expanding kind of scales. There's a chapter called Street, which is a little bit about design for autism. It's also about the history of cuts. We look at the kneeling bus, those kinds of phenomena. And then finally, the last chapter is called Clock, and it's not a chapter about objects per se, but about misfitting, the sort of adaptation work that happens in time. And I'm looking there especially at developmental disability, in part because I'm thinking about my son, who's 16 years old now, and about all the people that I know with developmental disabilities. for whom prosthetics and assistive technologies in the traditional sense are not really what's called for. The kind of mismatch there is much more about the normative order of how fast we are meant to get things done, and for whose sake. And so it's a look at kind of the normative pace, for example, of proceeding through a K-12 education or through university preparation to become a kind of economically productive citizen, and trying to look carefully and critically at our larger relationship to time, all of us in culture, in kind of post-industrial cultures, and what we might do to kind of extract ourselves from some of that relentless clock that is a kind of disciplining measure in our lives, and certainly it makes for the kind of misfitting for someone with Down syndrome in the contemporary world. And I try in each of those chapters to again point to the most optimistic, the most prototype tinkering, spirit of invention that I've witnessed in engineering and among the best designers, and to keep really close both a critical look at the ways that the normative order of the world does create barriers, but also the way those constraints have given birth to incredible inventive creativity, and that each of us shares, no matter the state of our body, the legacy of that creativity. So again, closed captioning and curb cuts, but also the independent living movement that came out of the 1960s and 70s from disability advocacy. Those are the folks who are there for us if and when our bodies change, as we get older. And the kind of continuum and the universe of hearing aids, all kinds of tools and technologies for thinking about the assistance that our bodies need and the inheritance of disability rights as a movement to give us a lot of that material culture. So that's kind of a sweep through.
Yeah, thank you. It really is a fascinating book, and I do recommend it to anybody to read. I'm just wondering, really finally, Sarah, if you have any thoughts about where your work is going to lead you in perhaps the immediate future. Is there any things on your, directions you're going in?
Yeah, I'm very interested in in teaching a class and perhaps doing some writing on design across the lifespan, because I certainly, the book left me thinking not just about developmental disability, but about time in our lives and about what it means to design for modes of dependence and assistance that come with the caregiving ecosystems that we all share. So disability has a particular strong place in that. But so in other words, I'm thinking about a class that's like, it starts, at the maternity ward, and goes to the preschool and then to the after school program and the job training center and, to the rehabilitation hospital, to assisted living, and even to hospice care. What would it look like to kind of trace the lifespan in a semester together and to place disability in this even richer ecosystem of caregiving, to try to give designers and engineers and hopefully just young civic actors the sense that all those places where help is being given and received, those are the most exciting and creative places where we can work. And I think sometimes there's just a persistent lack of imagination about the places where the frailty of the body shows up. I just think that people imagine that that is a pitiable state of affairs and not a place where there is both, again, creativity and urgency. I mean, I'm just drawing my two hands together. The alloy between those two things, I think, is missing from our discourse about disability broadly, but certainly in design when we think about where assistance is present. I'm also right now spending this sabbatical year from Olin writing just journalistic kind of feature stories about the future of work for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities. So people like my son Graham, who is thinking about his transition out of high school and just thinking about what's on the horizon. So hybrid college programs that are out there, but also some of the most creative kind of technology forward, they're often called in the United States, technology forward support systems for inclusive workplaces. So whereas in the past we would have relied on a one-to-one job coach, for example, what are the uses of smartphone apps, memory aids, and so on for people, again, with cognitive and developmental challenges? What makes the workplace meaningful to them? What is the role of work in our lives broadly and our human worth? And then what are the kind of design, the interesting service design, environments, technologies that make that possible? So that's kind of, again, I sort of left the book thinking I want to do more, in this realm of cognitive disability, because I think it's a richer, it's a tougher nut to crack, and there's legislation certainly coming down the pike in the U.S. that is insisting on a more inclusive workplace. Okay, good. What does that look like, and what are the most creative ways that we can make that a meaningful experience, not just as work as such, but what work stands for and symbolizes, and what people are hoping for. I'd also love to do in my own city a kind of like an annual weekend of tandem bike riding. I just love the tandem, and the tandem makes possible tandems, and also adaptive bikes of all kinds make biking accessible as a pleasurable experience for lots of people for whom a single rider, on a bike might not be motor-wise or sensory-wise possible. So I'm kind of like, that's a little twinkle in my eye right now. Like maybe we could do some tandem biking as a city in the future.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I'm wondering at this point, Claire, do we have any questions that have come in?
Hi, Roger. Yes, we do. So, from your career to date, what is the most pleasing aspect where you feel there's been the greatest impact, please?
Well, the most impact. I mean, I suppose it's a canonical example, but I never get over, the infrastructural retrofitting of cities with curb cuts and tactile pavers. I mean, what that made possible, for one thing, so what that made possible in the sense of navigating the world in a wheelchair at a dedicated slope in cities all over the world, what that literally and figuratively meant. So getting down the street, and in the United States, and I think in Europe, the slope is created such that you assume a kind of person can be on the street independently, by themselves. We could talk about modes of caregiving and whether that's a good thing to design for or not. But curb cuts assume that people will be unattended and need to get down the street. And curb cuts, again, rolled out in old cities at infrastructural scale to retrofit the built environment and make it freely passable. It's just hard to compete with that, what that did, because it got people not just down the sidewalk, but of course into the public sphere. So if you can get down the street, then you can, with some other modes of adaptation, get onto the bus or not, or the train, get into the voting booth, get into schools and workplaces. And just what that does to be in public, materially and conceptually. And when I think about in the US, what a hard-won fight that was. It's just hard to put an X variable on the way that changed the built world and what it made possible in people's minds, to retrofit and include elevators, again, in relatively old cities in American terms, in Boston, what it meant to undertake those projects, and what it's meant then as a kind of passable, more flexible built city structure. It's just hard to surpass.
Claire, do we have any further ones?
We do, Roger. Do you have plans for another book?
Well, I do have a couple of books in my, kind of in the hopper, but I think so much disability is so deeply inspiring to me that they have a little tie there, but they're actually about other kinds of issues that are too blurry right now to even name. So I'll go on writing some short pieces in journalism, as I said, but I think I'm a humanist first and foremost, and so I'm thinking a lot about history and the role of art and all kinds of other things. I think I'll go on teaching in design and disability and partnering and making work, but my writing is kind of going in some adjacent directions.
Thank you very much. Just before we close, this is to let you know we will have another webinar on April the 5th, same time, same place, when I shall be joined by one of our UKAAF board members, Jeff Mills, and we'll be talking about electronic documents and accessibility. And I'd like finally to thank you, Sarah, very, very much for joining us, giving of your time and letting us into your world and having a snapshot of all your work. I really look forward to learning much more about future activities and where everything is going to lead you.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be connected to the work that UKAAF is doing, and thank you for it in so many ways. And thanks for the invitation today. It's lovely to interact with you all.
And from me, thank you very much. And from all of us now, goodbye till next time.
Bye-bye.